The crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead as Rachel moved between tables, balancing a tray of champagne glasses with practiced ease. Her feet ached in the standard-issue black flats she'd worn for the past 6 hours, but she kept her professional smile firmly in place. This was just another Saturday evening at the Sterling Club, one of the most exclusive venues in the city where a single membership cost more than most people earned in a year. Rachel had been working here for 3 years now. 3 long years of serving expensive wines she couldn't afford to taste, clearing plates of food that cost more than her weekly groceries, and blending into the background while wealthy guests laughed and celebrated milestones she could only dream about. At 28 years old, this wasn't where she'd imagined herself. But life had a funny way of rewriting your plans when you weren't looking. She approached a table near the grand piano that sat in the corner of the ballroom. The instrument was a magnificent Steinway, worth probably $250,000. Its polished black surface reflected the warm glow of candlelight, and Rachel felt that familiar tug in her chest every time she walked past it. Her fingers twitched slightly as she set down fresh glasses for the guests, muscle memory responding to the mere sight of those keys. "More champagne, please," said one of the women at the table, barely glancing up from her conversation. Rachel nodded and poured carefully, making sure not to spill a single drop on the woman's dress. It looked like it cost more than Rachel's entire wardrobe combined. Nobody here knew her story. Nobody knew that those hands serving their drinks had once danced across piano keys, with the kind of skill that made professors weep. Nobody knew that she'd been accepted to one of the most prestigious music schools in the country, that instructors had called her a prodigy, that she'd dreamed of concert halls and standing ovations since she was 6 years old. But dreams don't pay hospital bills. Dreams don't cover the cost of chemotherapy or experimental treatments. Dreams don't sit beside your father's bed at 3 a.m, holding his hand while machines beep steadily in the darkness. Rachel pushed the memories away and moved to the next table. Stay focused. Stay present. The past was the past, and dwelling on it wouldn't change anything. Tonight was the annual Thornton Foundation Gala, one of the biggest events of the year at the Sterling Club. 300 guests had paid $15,000 per plate to attend, all proceeds going toward music education programs for underprivileged children. Rachel found the irony almost painful. Here she was, a woman who'd given up her own musical future, serving people who were paying premium prices to support other people's musical dreams. She caught sight of herself in one of the massive gilt-framed mirrors that lined the walls. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her uniform crisp and anonymous. She looked tired. The kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. "Excuse me, miss?" A man at table 12 was holding up his empty glass. Rachel hurried over with the champagne bottle, refilling his glass while he continued his conversation without pausing. She might as well have been invisible. Back in the service area, her co-worker David was loading clean glasses onto a tray. "Big crowd tonight," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "My legs are killing me." "Tell me about it," Rachel replied, stretching her back. "How many more hours?" "At least 3. They haven't even started the main program yet." David glanced toward the stage area where a magnificent grand piano sat waiting. "That pianist they hired is supposed to be some big deal. Victor Ashford or something." Rachel's heart skipped. Victor Ashford. She knew that name well, very well. She'd studied his recordings for years, memorizing every nuance of his interpretations. He was one of the finest classical pianists in the world, known for his emotional depth and technical brilliance. The fact that he was performing tonight made her chest ache with longing. "Yeah, he's incredible," she said quietly. David shrugged. "If you're into that kind of thing, I guess. Give me some good jazz any day." Rachel managed a small smile and headed back into the ballroom with her tray. As she moved through the crowd, she picked up fragments of conversations. Stock portfolios, vacation homes in the Hamptons, private jets, designer brands she'd never heard of. These people lived in a completely different universe. Near the stage, she noticed an older woman in an elegant navy gown speaking with a man in an expensive suit. Rachel recognized them both. The woman was Eleanor Vandermeer, chair of the Thornton Foundation and heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune. The man was James Chen, a tech entrepreneur who'd sold his company for billions a few years back. Both were regulars at these high society events. "The performance tonight should be extraordinary," Eleanor was saying as Rachel approached to collect empty glasses. Victor charges $100,000 for private performances now. We're lucky he still supports the foundation. Music education is crucial, James replied. I wouldn't be where I am without the free piano lessons I got at the community center when I was a kid. Rachel's hand trembled slightly as she reached for a glass. So he'd had help with his music education. He'd had opportunities. Good for him. She was genuinely glad, but it still hurt. She made her way back toward the kitchen, weaving through the crowd with her tray of empty glasses. In the small break room, she had exactly 5 minutes before she needed to be back on the floor. She sank into a plastic chair and closed her eyes, trying to will away the headache forming behind her temples. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her roommate asking if she'd be home late. Rachel typed back a quick yes and put the phone away. When she got home tonight, probably around midnight, she'd do what she did every night after these long shifts. She'd make herself a cup of tea, sit down at the second-hand upright piano wedged into the corner of her tiny studio apartment, and play. That piano was her secret world. It was old and slightly out of tune, with a few keys that stuck occasionally, but it was hers. She'd bought it with tips saved over 6 months, had it hauled up 3 flights of stairs by friends who thought she was crazy for spending money on something so impractical. But those keys were her therapy, her escape, her connection to the person she used to be. Late at night, when the building was quiet, she'd play everything she'd once performed in recitals. Chopin, Debussy, Rachmaninoff, Brahms. Her fingers still remembered every note even after all this time. Her technique was still there, maintained through sheer stubborn determination during stolen hours between shifts. She played for an audience of silent walls and her own reflection in the window, imagining sometimes what it might have been like if things had turned out differently. But those were just fantasies. This was reality. Tired feet, fake smiles, trays of champagne, and invisible service to people who would never know her name. Rachel stood up, smoothed her uniform, and checked her reflection in the small mirror by the door. Professional, polished, anonymous, perfect. She grabbed a fresh tray and headed back into the ballroom, where the wealthy guests were beginning to settle into their seats. The performance would start soon. Victor Ashford would play magnificently. Everyone would applaud, and Rachel would serve coffee during intermission. Just another evening at the Sterling Club, just another night of watching someone else live the dream she'd buried 3 years ago. She had no idea that in less than an hour, everything was about to change. Rachel was refilling water glasses at table 8 when she heard the commotion backstage. It started as hushed, urgent voices, then grew louder. She glanced toward the curtained area near the grand piano and saw Margaret, the event coordinator, rushing past with her phone pressed to her ear. The woman's face had gone pale. Something was wrong. Rachel continued her rounds, but she couldn't help noticing the growing sense of panic emanating from the backstage area. More staff members were hurrying back and forth, their professional composure cracking at the edges. She caught bits of whispered conversations as she passed. Is he okay? They're calling a doctor right now. What are we going to do about the performance? Rachel's stomach tightened. The performance. Victor Ashford. She set down her tray on a service table and moved closer to the stage area, staying out of the way but close enough to see what was happening. Through a gap in the curtain, she spotted him. Victor Ashford sat in a chair, his face twisted in pain, cradling his right hand against his chest. A small crowd had gathered around him, including Margaret and several venue staff members. Even from a distance, Rachel could see that something was seriously wrong. His hand looked stiff, the fingers curled unnaturally. It just seized up, she heard him saying, his voice strained. I've never had anything like this happen before. I can't move my fingers at all. A paramedic arrived, pushing through the crowd with a medical bag. Rachel watched as they examined his hand, asking questions, checking his vital signs. The words severe muscle spasm and needs immediate treatment floated across the space. Margaret stepped away from the group, her hand pressed to her forehead. She looked like she might be sick. Rachel understood why. 300 guests had paid a fortune to hear Victor Ashford perform. The entire evening was built around his appearance. Without him, the event would fall apart. Rachel moved back to her station, her heart racing. She tried to focus on her work, but her attention kept drifting to the unfolding crisis. She watched as Margaret made phone call after phone call, her voice growing more desperate with each conversation. Please, I know it's last minute, but we need someone who can play at a professional level. Yes, I understand it's Saturday evening. No, I completely understand. Thank you anyway. The guests were starting to notice that something was amiss. The program should have started 10 minutes ago. People were checking their watches, whispering to their table companions. Eleanor Vandermeer stood up and walked toward the stage, clearly intending to find out what was causing the delay. Rachel moved closer again, unable to help herself. She heard Margaret explaining the situation to Eleanor in hushed, frantic tones. Every pianist I know is either performing somewhere else tonight or unreachable. I've called 15 people. 15. Nobody's available on this short notice, and even if they were, most of them couldn't handle this repertoire. Victor was supposed to play Rachmaninoff, Chopin, Debussy. These aren't simple pieces. Eleanor's expression remained calm, but Rachel could see the concern in her eyes. What are our options? We could play recorded music, but that defeats the entire purpose. People came to see a live performance. Or we cancel that portion of the evening entirely and just focus on the dinner and auction. Or, Margaret's voice dropped even lower, or we find someone willing to attempt it, even if they're not at Victor's level. At least it would be something. Who did you have in mind? I don't have anyone. That's the problem. Rachel's hands were shaking. Her mouth had gone completely dry. She knew she should walk away, go back to serving drinks, mind her own business. But her feet wouldn't move. That piano was sitting there, silent and waiting. All those people had come to hear music that supported young musicians. Kids who maybe had dreams like she used to have. Before she could talk herself out of it, before rational thought could stop her, Rachel stepped forward. Excuse me. Both women turned to look at her. Margaret's expression was distracted, barely registering who had spoken. Eleanor gave her a polite but puzzled look. I'm sorry, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't help overhearing. I know this is going to sound strange, but I can play. Margaret blinked. I'm sorry, what? The piano. I can play what you need. There was a long pause. Margaret's expression shifted from confusion to something close to pity, as if Rachel had just said something embarrassing that they should all pretend hadn't happened. That's very sweet of you, Margaret said carefully. But this isn't casual playing. This is concert-level classical repertoire. These pieces require years of professional training. I know, Rachel said, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. I have that training. Margaret exchanged a glance with Eleanor. The doubt in both their faces was clear. Here was a waitress in a rumpled uniform, claiming she could replace one of the world's finest pianists. Look, Margaret said, not unkindly. I appreciate the offer, but we're talking about pieces like Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto. These aren't songs you can just pick up and play. I know Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto, Rachel said, her voice stronger now. All 3 movements. I also know Chopin's Ballad in G minor, Debussy's Clair de Lune and Arabesque, and most of Brahms' intermezzos. Something shifted in Eleanor's expression. She studied Rachel more carefully, really looking at her for the first time. Margaret was shaking her head. Where would you have learned all that? Juilliard. The word felt strange coming out of her mouth after so long. I was studying there before I had to leave. Juilliard? Margaret's skepticism was obvious. You went to Juilliard and now you're working as a waitress. Rachel felt heat rising in her cheeks, a mix of shame and defensiveness. My father got sick. I had to leave school to help with bills. I've been working here ever since. There was another long silence. Rachel could see the calculation happening behind Margaret's eyes. The risk of letting an unknown person perform versus the disaster of having no performance at all. This is crazy, Margaret muttered, but Rachel could hear the desperation underneath the words. Wait. A new voice joined the conversation. Victor Ashford himself had approached, still cradling his injured hand. His face was drawn with pain, but his eyes were sharp as he looked at Rachel. You studied at Juilliard? What years? Rachel told him. He nodded slowly. Who was your primary instructor? She answered that too, and several follow-up questions about technique and repertoire. With each answer, his expression changed. The skepticism didn't disappear entirely, but something else entered his gaze. Recognition, maybe, or at least possibility. She knows what she's talking about, he said finally to Margaret, at least about the theory and structure. Whether she can actually play. He looked at Rachel directly. Have you kept up with it? Do you still practice? Every night, Rachel said. After my shifts. I have a piano at home. Victor was quiet for a moment, studying her face. Rachel had the strange sensation that he could see right through her, could see all those late nights alone with her second-hand piano, all those hours of practice that nobody knew about. Let her try one piece, he said. Just one. If it's not good enough, we'll figure out something else. But if there's even a chance she can do this. He gestured with his good hand toward the ballroom full of waiting guests. Margaret looked like she wanted to argue, but Eleanor spoke up. I agree with Victor. What do we have to lose? 5 minutes to hear her play? Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, she looked at Rachel with an expression that was equal parts hope and dread. One piece. You have one chance.
If it's not absolutely perfect, we're stopping immediately.
Understood? Rachel nodded, not trusting her voice to work properly. Her entire body was trembling. You have 15 minutes to get ready, Margaret said, already turning to address the crisis of what Rachel would wear. How they'd introduce her. How they'd explain this to the audience. Don't make me regret this. Rachel stood there for a moment, paralyzed by what she'd just done. 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, she'd be walking onto that stage in front of 300 wealthy strangers. In 15 minutes, her two worlds were about to collide in the most terrifying way possible. She thought about running, just turning around and walking out the door, disappearing into the night where it was safe. But her feet carried her toward the dressing room instead, toward whatever was waiting on the other side of those 15 minutes. The dressing room was small and smelled faintly of perfume and hairspray. Rachel stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection like she was looking at a stranger. One of the venue staff had brought her a simple black dress, borrowed from somewhere backstage. It was slightly too big in the shoulders and a bit short, but it would have to do. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She splashed cold water on her face, trying to calm the panic rising in her chest. What had she been thinking? Standing up like that? Volunteering to perform in front of hundreds of people who'd paid thousands of dollars to be here. People who knew what real talent sounded like. People who were expecting Victor Ashford. You're going to be fine, she whispered to her reflection. But the woman staring back at her looked terrified. There was a knock on the door. 5 minutes, Margaret's voice called through the wood. 5 minutes. Rachel's stomach lurched. She pressed her palms flat against the counter, focusing on her breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Just like her old instructor used to tell her before performances. Stay calm, stay centered, but that was years ago. Back when she performed regularly, when her fingers knew what it felt like to play for an audience. How long had it been since she'd played for anyone other than herself? 3 years? 4? Another knock. Rachel? It's time. Her legs felt weak as she walked toward the door. Margaret stood in the hallway, her expression still uncertain. Behind her was David, her co-worker, his eyes wide with shock. Is it true? He asked. You're really going to play? Rachel couldn't find words, so she just nodded. That's insane, he said, but there was something like admiration in his voice. Good luck. Margaret led her through the backstage area. Rachel could hear the murmur of the audience beyond the curtain, 300 voices wondering what was causing the delay. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Listen, Margaret said, stopping just before they reached the stage entrance. I'm going to go out and explain what happened. That Victor had a medical emergency, that we have a substitute performer. I'll keep it brief. Then you walk out, sit down, and play. Just one piece for now. If it goes well, we'll figure out the rest. What if it doesn't go well? Rachel's voice came out hoarse. Ion softened slightly. Then we stop, I thank you for trying, and we move on to the dinner service. Either way, you're brave for attempting this. Brave or stupid, Rachel thought. Maybe both. She watched as Margaret walked through the curtain onto the stage. The crowd noise settled into expectant silence. Rachel's mouth was completely dry. Good evening, everyone. Margaret's voice carried through the ballroom. I apologize for the delay. I'm afraid I have some unfortunate news. Victor Ashford has experienced a medical emergency and won't be able to perform this evening. A wave of disappointed murmurs rippled through the audience. However, Margaret continued, we're fortunate to have a very talented substitute performer who has graciously agreed to play for us tonight. Please welcome Rachel Hayes. That was her cue. Rachel took a deep breath and stepped through the curtain. The lights were brighter than she expected. For a moment she couldn't see anything but white glare. Then her eyes adjusted and she saw them. Rows and rows of faces all turned toward her. Some curious, some confused, some clearly skeptical. She recognized several guests she'd served drinks to just an hour ago. Their expressions said it all. Wait, isn't that the waitress? The walk to the piano felt impossibly long. Her legs moved on autopilot while her mind screamed at her to run. The Steinway gleamed under the lights, beautiful and terrifying. She'd served past this piano hundreds of times, always stealing glances, always wondering what it would feel like to actually play it. Now she was about to find out. She sat down on the bench, her borrowed dress rustling. The piano was perfectly positioned, the height exactly right. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling. She could feel 300 pairs of eyes on her back. This was real. This was actually happening. Rachel closed her eyes for just a moment. In her mind, she was back in her tiny apartment, sitting at her old upright piano in the quiet darkness. Just her and the music. Nothing else mattered. No audience, no pressure, no judgment. Just the notes. She placed her fingers on the keys. Cool, smooth ivory beneath her skin. Familiar. Home. She'd chosen Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor. It was the piece she'd played for her final recital at Juilliard, right before everything fell apart. She knew it by heart, every phrase, every dynamic shift, every emotional turn. The opening notes came out tentatively. Her fingers felt stiff, uncertain. The sound seemed too loud in the vast space. But she pushed forward, letting muscle memory guide her through the opening phrases. Then something shifted. Maybe it was the fourth or fifth measure, or maybe it was somewhere deeper in the piece. But suddenly, Rachel wasn't thinking anymore. She wasn't aware of the audience or the fancy venue or the fact that she was wearing a borrowed dress that didn't fit. All of that fell away. There was only the music. Her fingers found their old confidence, moving across the keys with a fluidity she'd almost forgotten she possessed. The melody rose and fell, singing out into the ballroom. 3 years of silent practicing. 3 years of late nights alone with her second-hand piano. 3 years of holding everything inside. It all came pouring out through Chopin's notes. The technical passages that had once challenged her now felt like breathing. Her left hand drove the rhythm while her right hand soared through the melodic lines. The crescendos built with power she didn't know she still had. The quiet moments spoke with an intimacy that made her chest ache. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was playing her story. Every sacrifice, every disappointment, every night she'd fallen asleep exhausted and woken up to do it all over again. Every moment she'd looked at this piano while serving drinks and wondered, what if? All of it was there in the music. The piece built toward its dramatic climax. Her hands flew across the keyboard, attacking the powerful chords with everything she had. The piano responded magnificently, its rich sound filling every corner of the room. This instrument was so far beyond her old upright. It felt alive under her fingers, responsive to every subtle shift in pressure. Then came the quiet ending. The return to the opening theme, but changed now. Sadder, wiser. Her fingers barely whispered across the keys as the piece faded away. The final note hung in the air. Rachel sat very still, her hands frozen above the keyboard, her breathing ragged. For a long moment there was absolute silence. Then she heard it, a single person standing up, their chair scraping against the floor. Then another, and another. Rachel turned slowly on the bench, hardly daring to look. The entire ballroom was on its feet. Every single person. And they were applauding, not polite charity applause. Real applause. The kind that starts quietly and builds into something thunderous. The sound washed over her in waves, and Rachel felt tears starting to stream down her face. Eleanor Vandermeer was clapping with her hands raised high, a huge smile on her face. James Chen was nodding, looking impressed. The people she'd served drinks to earlier were staring at her like they'd never seen her before. Because they hadn't, she realized. They'd looked at her 100 times, but never actually seen her. The applause went on and on. Margaret stood at the side of the stage, her hand over her mouth, her own eyes wet. Even Victor Ashford had emerged from backstage, his injured hand still tucked against his chest, but his good hand clapping enthusiastically. Rachel stood up awkwardly, unsure what to do. Should she bow? She attempted a clumsy curtsy, which made her feel ridiculous, but the audience didn't seem to care. They kept clapping. Finally, the applause began to fade. Rachel expected Margaret to come out and thank her, to signal that her part was over. Instead, she saw Margaret and Victor having an urgent conversation at the edge of the stage. Then Margaret walked out to the microphone. "Rachel," she said, her voice warm now, genuinely impressed. "That was absolutely beautiful. Would you be willing to continue? Would you play the rest of tonight's program?" Rachel's heart stopped. The rest of the program? That meant at least 5 or 6 more pieces. Major works. An entire concert. She looked out at the audience. They were watching her expectantly, waiting for her answer. Some were already sitting back down, ready to hear more. She thought about her apartment, her second-hand piano, all those nights playing for no one. She thought about the dreams she'd buried, the life she'd convinced herself was over. Then she turned back to Margaret and nodded. The audience erupted in applause again as Rachel sat back down at the piano. Her hands were still shaking, but it was different now. Not fear, something else. For the first time in 3 years, Rachel felt alive. Rachel's fingers moved across the keys, starting Debussy's Clair de Lune. The gentle, flowing melody seemed to float through the ballroom like moonlight itself. She'd played this piece 1,000 times in her apartment, but here, on this magnificent piano, it sounded like something from a dream. The audience had settled into an attentive silence. No one was checking their phones or whispering to their neighbors anymore. They were actually listening. Really listening. As she transitioned into the middle section, Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not just the technical satisfaction of playing well, but the connection, that invisible thread that forms between a performer and an audience when the music really speaks. She could feel them with her, following every phrase, breathing with every pause. When the final notes of Clair de Lune faded, the applause came immediately. Warm and genuine, Rachel barely had time to acknowledge it before moving into her next piece. Brahms this time, one of his intermezzos. The melancholy melody seemed to reach into her chest and pull out feelings she'd been holding on to for too long. 40 minutes passed, like 5. She played Debussy's Arabesque, its playful runs bringing smiles to faces in the front row. Then Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, its romantic melody making the candlelit ballroom feel even more intimate. Her hands knew these pieces so completely that she barely had to think. The music just flowed through her. Finally, she reached the moment she'd been both anticipating and dreading. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the piece Victor Ashford had been scheduled to play. One of the most beloved and challenging works in the piano repertoire. Margaret's expressive course without an orchestra. She could only play the piano part, but even alone the piece was powerful. Those opening chords somber and magnificent. The sweeping melodies that seemed to contain all of human emotion. Longing, triumph, heartbreak, hope. Rachel poured everything she had into it. Her arms ached. Her back was starting to hurt from sitting for so long, but she didn't care. She was playing Rachmaninoff on a world-class piano in front of hundreds of people, and it felt like flying. The second movement was particularly special. That famous melody, tender and aching. She played it softly, intimately, like she was sharing a secret with everyone in the room. She could have sworn she saw people wiping their eyes. The third movement built to its powerful conclusion. Her hands raced across the keyboard, the notes tumbling out in cascades of sound. The final chords rang out triumphantly, filling every corner of the ballroom. Silence. Then an explosion of applause. This time, people weren't just clapping. They were cheering. Actually cheering. Rachel stood up from the bench, her legs unsteady, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. She tried to bow, and the applause grew even louder. The standing ovation lasted so long that Rachel started to feel embarrassed. She didn't know where to look or what to do with her hands. Finally, Margaret came back onto the stage and gently guided her off to the side. "That was incredible," Margaret said, and there were tears in her eyes. Absolutely incredible. But Rachel barely heard her, because Eleanor Vandermeer was walking toward her, followed by James Chen and at least a dozen other guests. They were all trying to reach her at once. "My dear," Eleanor said, taking both of Rachel's hands in hers. The same hands Rachel had served champagne to earlier now held hers with something like reverence. "How is it possible that you've been working here for 3 years and nobody knew you could do this?" Rachel opened her mouth, but words wouldn't come. Her throat was tight with emotion. "I'd like to know that too," said James Chen, his expression serious but kind. "What's your story? How does someone with that level of talent end up serving drinks instead of performing?" Other people crowded closer, all wanting to hear her answer. Rachel felt overwhelmed, trapped. But there was something in their faces, genuine curiosity, real interest that made her want to try. "My father got sick," she said quietly. "Cancer. I was at Juilliard, but the bills were too much. I had to drop out to help. By the time he passed away, I'd been gone too long. Couldn't afford to go back, so I just kept working." The crowd had gone silent, listening to every word. "And you kept playing?" Eleanor asked gently. "At home, by myself. I have an old piano in my apartment. I couldn't give it up completely." 3 years of playing alone, James said, shaking his head. "That's dedication most people can't imagine." A woman Rachel didn't recognize spoke up. "That performance was better than half the concerts I've paid hundreds of dollars to attend. You have real talent, the kind that shouldn't be wasted." "It's not wasted," Rachel said automatically, then stopped. Was it wasted? She'd convinced herself that keeping music as a private thing, something just for her, was enough. But standing here now, feeling the way that performance had connected her to all these people, she wasn't so sure anymore. Victor Ashford had made his way through the crowd. Up close, he looked tired and in pain, but his eyes were bright. "You played my program better than I could have tonight," he said, "even with 2 good hands." "You know why?" Rachel shook her head. "Because you played it like you had something to prove, like it meant everything. That kind of passion, you can't fake it. You can't learn it. Either you have it or you don't." He paused. "You have it." "Thank you," Rachel whispered. "That means more than you know. I've studied your recordings for years. I could tell. You borrowed some of my phrasing in the Rachmaninoff." He smiled. "The student becomes the teacher." "How long since you had proper instruction?" 3 years. "Since I left school." "Criminal," Victor muttered. "Absolute waste." Eleanor had been listening to this exchange carefully. Now she stepped forward again, and Rachel noticed that her expression had changed. She looked determined, like a businesswoman who'd just made a decision. "Rachel, I'd like to talk to you about something. Not here, not now, you must be exhausted, but soon. Very soon." She pulled out a business card and pressed it into Rachel's hand. "Call my office tomorrow. We need to discuss your future." "My future?" Rachel looked at the card. Eleanor Vandermeer, it read, with about 6 titles after her name. "You can't go back to serving drinks," James said firmly. "Not after tonight. That would be like watching a bird that can fly choosing to stay in a cage." Other people chimed in, all talking at once. Someone mentioned a music school. Someone else talked about performance opportunities. A man in an expensive suit said he knew a talent agent. The voices blurred together until Rachel couldn't process any of it. "Give her some space," Margaret said, suddenly protective. "She just played for over an hour. She needs rest." The crowd reluctantly backed off, but not before several more people pressed business cards into Rachel's hands. She looked down at them, confused. An hour ago, she'd been invisible. Now everyone wanted to talk to her. "Come on," Margaret said quietly, taking her elbow. "Let's get you out of here before they mob you completely." She led Rachel back toward the dressing room. Rachel's mind was spinning. What had just happened? What did Eleanor mean about her future? What were all these people offering? In the dressing room, she sank into a chair and stared at the pile of business cards in her lap. Her hands were still trembling, but now it was from more than just exhaustion. Her phone buzzed in her locker. She pulled it out and saw dozens of notifications. Text messages from her roommate, from other coworkers, from people she hadn't talked to in years. How did they already know? Then she saw why. Someone had recorded her performance. A guest must have pulled out their phone and filmed it. The video was already circulating online, already being shared and liked and commented on. Rachel clicked on the video. There she was, in that borrowed black dress, sitting at the Steinway. The camera shook a little, but the audio was surprisingly clear. She watched herself playing, saw her own face transformed by concentration and emotion. She looked like a different person. Not the tired waitress who'd started this shift. Someone else entirely. The video already had thousands of views. In the comments, people were asking who she was, where she'd come from, when they could hear her play again. Rachel set down her phone and looked at herself in the mirror. The same face she'd seen a few hours ago, but everything had changed. She could feel it, that shift in the air like the moment before a storm breaks. Her old life, the one where she was invisible and safe, was over. Whatever came next, there was no going back. She picked up Eleanor's business card and held it up to the light. Tomorrow she'd make that call. Tomorrow she'd find out what future meant. Tonight, She just sat there in the quiet dressing room, trying to understand that everything had changed with a single decision to step forward and play. Rachel didn't sleep that night. She sat on her bed, still in the borrowed black dress, staring at her phone as the numbers kept climbing. 10,000 views. 20,000. 50,000. By sunrise, the video had been watched by over 200,000 people. The comments were overwhelming. Professional musicians praising her technique. Music teachers asking where she'd studied. Concert venues asking how to book her. And hundreds of regular people just saying that her playing had moved them to tears. At 8 in the morning, her phone rang. Eleanor Vandermeer's office. Rachel's hands shook as she answered. Within 5 minutes, she had an appointment scheduled for that afternoon. When she hung up, she realized she'd been holding her breath. The meeting took place in Eleanor's downtown office, a space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Eleanor sat behind a massive desk, but she stood and came around it when Rachel entered, greeting her with a warm handshake. "Sit, please," Eleanor said, gesturing to a comfortable chair. "Can I get you anything? Coffee, water?" "I'm fine, thank you." Rachel perched on the edge of the seat, her back straight, still not quite believing this was real. "I'll get straight to the point," Eleanor said. "Last night you gave one of the most remarkable performances I've witnessed in 20 years of funding the arts. It would be a tragedy for the world to lose that talent because of financial circumstances." Rachel's throat tightened. "I appreciate that, but I'm not sure what you're suggesting. I'm suggesting that I pay for you to complete your degree at Juilliard. Full tuition, living expenses, everything you need." The words hung in the air. Rachel stared at Eleanor, unable to process what she'd just heard. "I can't accept that," she finally managed. "That's too much. I couldn't possibly." "You can and you should," Eleanor interrupted gently. "Do you know what the Thornton Foundation's mission is? We support young musicians who have talent but lack opportunity. You're exactly who we're meant to help. The only difference is that we're finding you a few years later than we should have. But I'm not young anymore. I'm 28. Most of the students there will be, so you'll be a little older." "So what?" Eleanor leaned forward. "Rachel, I've donated millions to music education over the years. I've funded hundreds of scholarships. But rarely do I get to see the direct impact of that work. Last night, watching you play, understanding your story, that's why I do this. Let me help you." Rachel felt tears starting to form. She blinked them back. "Why?" "You don't even know me. I know enough. I know you kept practicing for 3 years with no audience, no teacher, no hope of performing professionally. Most people would have quit. You didn't. That tells me everything I need to know about your dedication." Before Rachel could respond, there was a knock on the door. James Chen walked in, apologizing for being late. "I wanted James here for this conversation," Eleanor explained, "because he has his own proposal." James sat down, looking at Rachel with that same serious expression from the night before. "I grew up poor," he said. "Really poor. The kind of poor where you're not sure if there's going to be dinner. A free music program at my community center changed my life. Gave me something to focus on, kept me off the streets, taught me discipline." Rachel nodded, listening. "I never became a professional musician. Turned out I was better with computers. But those early music lessons shaped who I became. They matter." He paused. "I want to create a scholarship fund in your name. The Rachel Hayes Music Scholarship. For students who have to leave school for financial reasons, so they can come back and finish what they started." Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. "What? No, you can't do that." "I absolutely can, and I'm going to. You'll help administer it once you're back on your feet. Help us identify students who need support. But the fund will start with $500,000, and I'll add to it every year." $500,000. Rachel couldn't finish the sentence. The number was incomprehensible. "Your story matters," James said firmly. "It needs to be told, and it needs to help other people who are going through what you went through." The next few days passed in a blur. The video of Rachel's performance went viral, eventually reaching over 20 million views. News outlets picked up the story. "Waitress stuns wealthy guests with secret piano talent," read one headline. "From serving drinks to concert hall dreams," read another. Rachel received calls from talent agents, concert venues, and music producers. A recording studio wanted her to make an album. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell her story. The attention was overwhelming and sometimes frightening. But Eleanor and James helped her navigate it all, connecting her with professionals who had her best interests at heart. 3 months later, Rachel moved back to New York to resume her studies at Juilliard. Walking through those familiar halls felt surreal, like stepping back in time but as a different person. She was older than most of her classmates now, and she'd lived through experiences they couldn't imagine, but none of that mattered once she sat down at the piano. Her instructors were impressed by how much she'd retained, how well she'd maintained her technique during those years away. Most students who take a 3-year break lose significant ground, her primary teacher told her. You've actually improved. That's remarkable. I never really took a break, Rachel explained. I just played for different reasons. 6 months after that night at the Sterling Club, Rachel gave her first official concert at a small venue in Manhattan. Every seat sold out within hours. Eleanor and James sat in the front row, along with Victor Ashford, who'd become an unexpected mentor. Margaret came too, and David, and several other staff members from the Sterling Club. Before she walked onto stage, Rachel stood in the wings, breathing deeply. She thought about that night, how terrified she'd been, how close she'd come to just staying silent and invisible, how one moment of courage had changed everything. The performance was everything she'd dreamed of. The audience was full of strangers who'd come specifically to hear her play, people who'd seen the video and wanted to experience her music in person. When she finished, the standing ovation lasted so long she had to return for 2 encores. Backstage afterward, a young woman approached her nervously. She looked about 19, dressed in thrift store clothes, her eyes red like she'd been crying. I'm sorry to bother you, the girl said, but I needed to tell you something. I was about to drop out of music school. Money problems. I was ready to give up on everything. Then I saw your video and I read your story and She trailed off, wiping her eyes. You made me believe it was still possible, that it's not over just because life gets hard. Rachel felt her own eyes filling with tears. She pulled the girl into a hug. What's your name? Christina. Christina, listen to me. It's not over. Keep playing. Keep fighting. And if you need help, Rachel pulled out one of the cards for James's scholarship fund. Apply here. That's what it's for. A year after the viral video, Rachel performed at Carnegie Hall. It was the dream she'd thought was dead forever, the impossible goal she'd stopped letting herself imagine. But there she was, walking onto one of the most famous stages in the world, her name on the marquee. The program included the same pieces she'd played that night at the Sterling Club. Chopin, Debussy, Brahms, and of course Rachmaninoff. But before she started, she did something unusual. She asked the house manager to bring out a serving tray and champagne glasses. The audience watched, confused, as Rachel picked up the tray and carried it across the stage, balancing it the way she'd done thousands of times. I worked as a waitress for 3 years, she told the audience. And for 3 years, people looked right through me like I didn't exist. But I did exist. I was there, invisible, carrying dreams nobody could see. She set down the tray carefully and walked to the piano. This is for everyone who feels invisible. Everyone who's working hard at something nobody notices. Everyone who keeps going even when it seems pointless. She sat down at the bench. You exist. Your dreams matter. Don't stop. The performance was transcendent. Critics called it one of the finest piano recitals of the year. But for Rachel, the best moment came at the end. During the standing ovation, when she saw Christina in the audience, clapping with tears streaming down her face. After the concert, Rachel met with reporters and photographers, something she'd slowly gotten used to. One journalist asked her what she'd learned from her experience. Rachel thought for a moment. I learned that your value isn't determined by whether people see you or not. I was the same person serving drinks as I am playing Carnegie Hall. The only difference is opportunity and courage. Do you have any regrets? Another reporter asked. About what happened to my father? Of course, I'd give up everything to have him back. Rachel paused. But about the path I took? No. Those years working, struggling, playing alone, they shaped me. They gave me something to say with the music. You can't fake that kind of experience. Late that night, Rachel returned to her apartment exhausted but happy. Her old secondhand piano still sat in the corner, even though she now had access to much better instruments. She sat down at it and played a simple melody, the same one she'd played countless times during those long, lonely years. It sounded exactly the same as it always had, a little out of tune, a few sticky keys, the worn ivory smooth under her fingers. But it was still her favorite piano, because it was the one that had kept her dream alive when everything else said to let it go. Rachel thought about that night at the Sterling Club, that single moment when she'd stepped forward and said, "I can play." 3 words that had changed everything. 3 words that had required more courage than anything else she'd ever done. She'd been invisible, and then she wasn't. She'd been silent, and then she sang. And now she made sure that everyone else who felt invisible knew that they weren't alone, that their moment might be coming, that they just had to hold on and be ready to step forward when it arrived. Because you never know when an ordinary evening might become the one you remember forever.